The waiter pays the bill for a poor old woman and is fired by the restaurant owner. Minutes later, the old woman's husband arrives, and everyone is paralyzed upon recognizing him. The crash of broken plates echoed throughout the elegant restaurant Lucille door, instantly silencing the murmur of conversations and the tinkling of cutlery against fine porcelain. All eyes turned to the entrance, where an elderly woman of frail appearance lay on the floor, surrounded by the remains of an elaborate seafood tower she had just accidentally knocked over. Carlos, a 25-year-old waiter, was the first to react. Without thinking twice, he left the tray he was carrying on the nearest table and ran towards the fallen woman. The smell of seafood mingled with the unmistakable aroma of poverty emanating from the old woman's tattered clothes. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Carlos asked, kneeling beside her, ignoring the disgusted looks from the nearest diners. The woman tried to respond, but only managed to emit a weak gasp. Her sunken eyes in a face furrowed by wrinkles and hardships opened wide with a mixture of shame and panic. She tried to get up, leaning on her trembling elbows, but her fragile body didn't respond. He noticed something was wrong. The old woman's breathing was becoming increasingly labored, and a sharp whistle escaped her dry lips with each inhalation. "She's having an asthma attack," he exclaimed, recognizing the symptoms thanks to the first aid course he had taken the previous summer. Panic spread through the restaurant like a shock wave. The murmurs turned into exclamations of concern and some startled shouts. A middle-aged woman dressed in a designer suit stood up from her table. "Someone call an ambulance," she shouted, taking her mobile phone out of her purse. While chaos erupted around him, Carlos remained calm. He leaned over the old woman, speaking to her in a soft but firm voice. "Ma'am, I'm Carlos. I'm going to help you. Try to stay calm and breathe with me, okay?" The woman nodded weakly, her eyes filled with equal parts gratitude and fear. Carlos began to guide her through a breathing exercise, exaggerating his own inhalations and exhalations for her to follow. "Inhale through your nose slowly. 1, 2, 3. Now exhale through your mouth as if you were blowing out a candle. 1, 2, 3, 4. He repeated the process over and over, maintaining eye contact with the old woman at all times. Meanwhile, the restaurant had descended into controlled chaos. The maître d'hôtel, a tall, thin man named Francois, tried to maintain order among the diners, many of whom had risen from their tables to get a better view of what was happening. "Please, ladies and gentlemen, return to your tables. The situation is under control," Francois repeated, although his trembling voice betrayed his own uncertainty. In the kitchen, the executive chef Marcel Leblanc, a burly man with a well-groomed mustache, poked his head through the swinging door. "What the hell is going on out here?" he growled, his face reddened by the heat of the stoves and irritation. Nobody answered him, all attention was focused on Carlos and the old woman. The young waiter continued guiding the woman's breathing, noticing with relief that the whistling in her chest was beginning to diminish. "That's it, you're doing very well," Carlos encouraged her, gently holding her wrinkled hand. "Keep breathing with me. The ambulance will be here soon." At that moment, the restaurant manager, a man named Gustavo Mendez, emerged from his office at the back of the establishment. With his impeccable suit and perfectly combed hair, Gustavo seemed more concerned about the restaurant's image than the old woman's health. "What's all this commotion?" he demanded to know, his voice sharp as a knife. His eyes fell on Carlos and the old woman, and his expression turned into a grimace of disgust. "Carlos, what do you think you're doing?" Carlos barely looked up. "Mr. Mendez, this lady is having an asthma attack. I'm helping her breathe until the ambulance arrives." Gustavo frowned, looking around and noting the expressions of the customers, which oscillated between concern and fascination. "This is unacceptable," he muttered under his breath. "Francois, take this woman to the office immediately. We can't have this spectacle in the middle of the dining room." Francois hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the order. "But sir, moving her could worsen her condition. I said take her to the office." Gustavo barked, his face reddening with anger. Carlos, who had been focused on helping the old woman, finally looked up at his boss. "With all due respect, Mr. Mendez, we can't move her. She needs to stay still and keep breathing until the paramedics arrive." The tension in the air was palpable. The customers watched the exchange with a mixture of astonishment and disapproval towards the manager's attitude. A couple at a nearby table even began to gather their things, muttering something about the lack of humanity. Gustavo, noting the negative reactions, was forced to back down. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But as soon as the ambulance arrives, I want this resolved immediately. And you, Carlos, we'll have a talk later." While this scene unfolded, the old woman's breathing began to normalize. Color slowly returned to her cheeks, and the panic in her eyes gave way to deep exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered in a hoarse voice, weakly squeezing Carlos's hand. "I don't know what I would have done without you, young man." Carlos smiled warmly at her. "You have nothing to thank me for, ma'am." "What's your name?" "Rosa," she replied, a small smile lighting up her tired face. "Rosa Martinez. Pleased to meet you, Dona Rosa," said Carlos. "Do you feel strong enough to sit up?" Rosa nodded slowly. Carefully, Carlos helped her sit up, supporting her against the nearest wall. It was then that he noticed something he had overlooked in the midst of the crisis: a small plastic bag that Rosa had been carrying, filled with empty cans and bottles collected from the street. The realization hit Carlos like a punch to the stomach. This woman wasn't just a sick elderly person, she was a homeless person who had probably entered the restaurant looking for a bit of warmth or perhaps some leftovers. The young waiter felt his heart shrink. He looked around, noticing the looks of pity and disgust that some customers were directing towards Rosa. How could they be so insensitive? Didn't they see that this was a person who needed help, not judgments? At that moment, the sirens of an ambulance were heard in the distance, rapidly approaching. A collective sigh of relief ran through the restaurant. "They're coming to help you, Dona Rosa," said Carlos, giving her a gentle squeeze on the shoulder. "You'll be in good hands soon." Rosa nodded, but there was a shadow of concern in her eyes. "Young man," she said in a low voice, "I don't have any way to pay for an ambulance or a hospital. I just came in because I was cold and the smell of food." Her voice broke, and tears began to roll down her wrinkled cheeks. Carlos felt a lump form in his throat. Without thinking twice, he made a decision that would change the course of the night, and possibly his life. "Don't worry about that now, Dona Rosa," he said firmly. "I'll take care of everything." Just at that moment, two paramedics hurriedly entered the restaurant, carrying their equipment. Carlos waved to them and quickly explained the situation while they began to attend to Rosa. As the paramedics worked, Carlos approached Francois, who was still standing nearby, observing the scene with a mixture of concern and relief. "Francois," Carlos said in a low voice, "I need a favor. Can you bring me the bill for table 6? Francois looked at him confused. "Table 6? But nobody has ordered anything there tonight." "I know," Carlos replied. "Just bring me a blank bill, please." Still confused, Francois nodded and headed towards the cash register. Meanwhile, the paramedics had finished their initial evaluation of Rosa. "Her condition has stabilized," one of them reported, "but we need to take her to the hospital for evaluation and possible treatment." Rosa began to protest weakly, but Carlos intervened. "It's for your own good, Dona Rosa. Please, let them take care of you properly." With a sigh of resignation, Rosa finally nodded. As the paramedics helped her onto a stretcher, Francois returned with the blank bill Carlos had requested. Carlos took the pen he carried in his shirt pocket and, without hesitation, wrote an amount on the bill: $500. It was practically all he had saved, the money he had been saving to buy a used motorcycle, but at that moment nothing seemed more important to him than helping this woman that fate had put in his path. He approached the paramedics and handed them the bill along with his debit card. "This should cover the transport costs and part of the treatment," he said. "Please make sure she receives the care she needs." The paramedics looked at him surprised, but nodded with respect. "You're a good man," said one of them, passing the card through the portable reader. As they were taking Rosa away on the stretcher, she extended a trembling hand towards Carlos. "God bless you, boy," she whispered, with tears of gratitude in her eyes. "I will never forget what you have done for me today." Carlos took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Take care of yourself, Dona Rosa. I hope you recover soon." When the ambulance drove away with its flashing lights illuminating the night, an uncomfortable silence fell over the restaurant. The customers slowly began to return to their tables, commenting in low voices about what they had just witnessed. Carlos stood at the entrance for a moment, processing everything that had happened. It was then that he felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He turned to find himself face to face with Gustavo Mendez, whose expression was a mixture of irritation and something that seemed almost like admiration. "Carlos," said Gustavo, his voice tense, "I need to see you in my office. Now." The young waiter nodded, knowing that what was coming wasn't going to be pleasant. As he followed Gustavo to the back of the restaurant, he could feel the gazes of his colleagues and customers on him. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with curiosity, and a few with something that seemed to be respect. Gustavo's office was a small but luxuriously decorated space, with a mahogany desk and shelves filled with cookbooks and expensive wine bottles. The manager sat behind the desk and indicated to Carlos to take a seat in front of him. "Carlos," Gustavo began, clasping his hands on the desk, "what you've done tonight is complicated." Carlos straightened in his chair, preparing to defend his actions. "Mr. Mendez, I know it's not usual, but that woman needed help. I couldn't just." Gustavo raised a hand, interrupting him. "Your quick action probably saved that woman's life. That's admirable." He paused, and his expression hardened. "On the other hand, you've put the reputation of this establishment at risk. Lucille d'Or is known for its exclusivity and its high-level clientele. We can't have, well, people from the street coming in and causing scenes like this." Carlos felt anger beginning to boil inside him. "With all due respect, sir, are you saying that a person's life is worth less than the restaurant's reputation?" Gustavo sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's not that simple, Carlos. This business depends on maintaining a certain image. If we start to be known as a place where anyone can come in and cause a commotion, we'll lose customers. And if we lose customers, people lose their jobs, including you." "But surely..." Carlos began, but Gustavo interrupted him again. "Furthermore," the manager continued, his voice taking on a harsher tone, "you paid that woman's bill with the restaurant's money. That's theft, technically speaking." Carlos was left speechless for a moment, unable to believe what he had just heard. The accusation of theft hit him like a slap in the face. "Theft?" he repeated, his voice trembling with indignation. "Mr. Mendez, with all due respect, I didn't use the restaurant's money. I paid the bill with my own money, from my personal savings." Gustavo seemed surprised for an instant, but quickly regained his composure. "Your own savings? Why would you do something like that for a complete stranger?" "Because it was the right thing to do," Carlos replied without hesitation. "That woman needed help, and I was in a position to give it to her. Isn't that what we should do as human beings?" A tense silence fell over the office. Gustavo stared at Carlos as if seeing him for the first time. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to say something else, but then he shook his head, and his expression hardened again. "As noble as your intention may be, Carlos, the fact is that you've violated several restaurant policies tonight," said Gustavo, his voice cold and professional. "You allowed entry to a person who clearly didn't meet our dress standards, you abandoned your post without authorization to attend to her, and most seriously, you caused a disturbance that bothered our regular customers." Carlos felt his blood boiling in his veins. "Are you serious? Would you have preferred that I let that poor woman die at the door of your precious restaurant?" "Of course not," exclaimed Gustavo, slamming his palm on the desk. "But there were ways to handle the situation without creating all this circus. You could have discreetly called an ambulance and had her taken out through the back door." "Had her taken out through the back door?" Carlos interrupted incredulously. "As if she were trash that needs to be hidden. Is that how you treat people who need help?" Gustavo stood up, his face reddened with anger. "Watch your tone, boy. I'm your boss, and you owe me respect." Carlos also stood up, facing Gustavo eye to eye. "Respect is earned, Mr. Mendez. And I'm sorry, but I can't respect someone who values status and appearances more than human life." For a moment, it seemed that Gustavo was going to explode. But then, to Carlos's surprise, the manager let out a bitter laugh and dropped back into his chair. "You're young and idealistic, Carlos," said Gustavo, suddenly sounding tired. "You think the world is black and white, that there's always a clear choice between good and evil. But reality is much more complicated. I have responsibilities, not just to the customers, but to all the employees of this restaurant. Every decision I make affects their lives and their livelihoods." Carlos felt his anger beginning to subside, replaced by a mixture of frustration and sadness. "I understand you have responsibilities, Mr. Mendez, but don't you think we also have a responsibility to our community? To people less fortunate than us?" Gustavo sighed deeply. "Maybe you're right, Carlos. Maybe I've lost sight of some important things in my eagerness to keep this business afloat. But the fact is that rules exist for a reason, and you've broken them tonight." Carlos felt a knot forming in his stomach. He knew what was coming next. "I'm sorry, Carlos," said Gustavo, his voice firm but not without a hint of regret, "but you leave me no choice. You're fired." The words fell like a hammer blow. Even though he saw it coming, Carlos felt as if all the air had been knocked out of his lungs. This job had been his livelihood, his way of helping his family and saving for his studies. And now, in an instant, it had all vanished. "I understand," said Carlos after a moment, his voice surprisingly calm. "Can I at least finish my shift? I owe that to my colleagues." Gustavo seemed surprised by Carlos's composure. After a moment of reflection, he nodded. "All right. Finish your shift, and then gather your things. I'll pay you until the end of the week. Consider it severance pay." Carlos nodded silently and headed towards the door. Before leaving, he stopped and looked at Gustavo one last time. "Mr. Mendez," he said, "I know you think you're doing the right thing for the business. But I hope that someday you'll realize that there are things more important than money and status. Compassion and humanity are what really define us as people." Without waiting for a response, Carlos left the office, gently closing the door behind him. He took a moment to breathe deeply, trying to process everything that had happened in the last hour. He had saved a life, but he had lost his job. Was it worth it? Without a doubt, Carlos knew the answer was yes. With his head held high, he headed back to the dining room. The rest of the night was going to be long and difficult, but he was determined to maintain his dignity and professionalism until the end. As he walked, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held for him, and if he would ever see Dona Rosa again. What Carlos didn't know was that fate had some more surprises in store for him that night, and that his act of kindness would have consequences he couldn't even imagine. When Carlos returned to the dining room, the atmosphere had noticeably changed. The customers looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and what seemed to be admiration. His co-workers, who had been observing the scene from afar, approached him with expressions of concern. "What happened, Carlos?" asked Maria, one of the restaurant's most senior waitresses. Carlos gave a sad smile. "You could say I've been fired for what happened with the lady." A murmur of indignation ran through the group of employees. Francois, the maitre d'hotel, approached with a frown. "This is unacceptable," he said in a low but firm voice. "They can't fire you for helping someone in need. We should do something. Perhaps a strike or—" "No, Francois," Carlos interrupted, putting a hand on the older man's shoulder. "I appreciate your support, but I don't want anyone else to get in trouble because of me. Besides, I've already made my decision. I'm going to finish my shift with my head held high and then I'll leave." The other employees exchanged looks of concern and respect. Carlos had always been loved among his colleagues for his work ethic and positive attitude, and seeing him in this situation deeply affected them. "At least let us buy you some beers after the shift," proposed Pedro, one of the cooks. To say goodbye properly, Carlos smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thanks, guys. I'd like that." With a final handshake and words of encouragement, the group dispersed to return to their tasks. Carlos took a deep breath and prepared to face the rest of the night. He decided that if this was going to be his last shift at Lucille d'Or, he would make it memorable for the right reasons. He approached his first table with a genuine smile. "Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Carlos, and I'll be your waiter tonight. Can I offer you something to drink to start?" As the night progressed, Carlos found himself working with renewed energy and enthusiasm. Every dish he served, every customer he attended to, became a small celebration of what true service meant. It wasn't just about bringing food and drinks. It was about creating human connections, making people feel valued and cared for. The customers seemed to feel the difference. Many praised his service, commenting on his positive attitude and attention to detail. Some even mentioned that they had seen him help the old woman and expressed their admiration for his actions. At one of the tables, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit stopped him when he was about to leave after taking their order. "Excuse me, young man," said the man, his voice deep and kind. "Are you the waiter who helped that poor woman earlier?" Carlos nodded, a little uncomfortable with the attention. "Yes, sir. I just did what anyone would have done." The man smiled, an expression of genuine approval on his face. "I'm not so sure about that. What you did was extraordinary. This world needs more people like you." "Thank you, sir," Carlos replied, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. "I appreciate your words." As he walked away from the table, Carlos couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. It was ironic that he was receiving so much praise on the very night he was losing his job. But at the same time, he felt a strange sense of peace. He knew in his heart that he had done the right thing, and that was worth more than any job. The night wore on, and the restaurant began to empty. Carlos was cleaning a table when he noticed Gustavo coming out of his office and heading towards him with a determined step. He prepared for another confrontation, but to his surprise, the manager's face showed no anger, but rather a complicated expression that seemed to mix regret and resignation. "Carlos," Gustavo said in a low voice, "can we talk for a moment?" Intrigued, Carlos nodded and followed Gustavo to a quiet corner of the restaurant. "I've been thinking about what happened," Gustavo began, avoiding eye contact. "And well, maybe I was too harsh on you." Carlos remained silent, waiting to see where this conversation was going. "What you did for that woman was admirable," Gustavo continued, "and you're right. There are more important things than money and status. I've received several calls from customers tonight praising your actions and your service. Some even threatened not to return if I fired you." Carlos blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected his act to have such an impact on the customers. Gustavo finally looked him in the eyes. "What I'm trying to say is, if you're willing, I'd like you to reconsider your position here. The restaurant needs people like you, Carlos. People with integrity and compassion." For a moment, Carlos was speechless. Part of him wanted to accept the offer immediately, to return to the safety of his job and forget the whole thing. But another part, a part that had been strengthened that night, knew that things couldn't simply go back to the way they were before. "I appreciate your offer, Mr. Mendez," Carlos finally said. "I really do. But I think we both know that things have changed. I can't work in a place where I have to compromise my values, or where people are treated differently based on their appearance or status." Gustavo nodded slowly, as if he already expected this answer. "I understand and respect your decision, Carlos. You're a young man with principles, and that will take you far in life." He extended his hand. "I wish you the best in your future endeavors, and thank you for reminding me what's really important." Carlos shook Gustavo's hand, feeling that something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer simply boss and employee, but two men who had learned a valuable lesson that night. "Thank you, Mr. Mendez," said Carlos, "for giving me the opportunity to work here, and for this conversation. I hope Lucille Dor continues to prosper, but also that it finds ways to be more inclusive and compassionate in the future." As he cleaned his last table, Carlos couldn't help but reflect on the events of the night. He had lost his job, yes, but he had gained something much more valuable, the certainty that he was capable of staying true to his principles, even in the most difficult circumstances. When he finally hung up his apron for the last time, his colleagues surrounded him. There were hugs, words of encouragement, and promises to stay in touch. Carlos felt overwhelmed by the support and affection of these people with whom he had shared so many hours of hard work and laughter. "Don't forget you owe us some beers," Pedro reminded him with a smile, patting him on the back. Carlos laughed, feeling a mixture of nostalgia and excitement for what was to come. "I won't forget. I'll see you at the usual bar in half an hour." The morning after the incident at Lucille Dor dawned gray and rainy, as if the weather reflected Carlos's mood. He woke up with a slight headache, a reminder of the beers shared the night before with his now ex-coworkers. Despite the hangover and uncertainty about his future, he didn't regret his actions. Carlos got out of bed and headed to the small kitchen of his shared apartment. His roommate, Miguel, was already there preparing coffee. "Good morning, hero," Miguel greeted with an ironic smile. "How does it feel to be unemployed and famous at the same time?" Carlos grunted in response, gratefully accepting the cup of coffee Miguel offered him. "Famous? What are you talking about?" Miguel raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Haven't you seen social media? Your story has gone viral. Someone at the restaurant recorded part of what happened and uploaded it to TikTok. Now everyone's talking about the hero waiter who saved an old lady and was fired for it." Carlos almost choked on his coffee. "What? You have to be joking." "Not at all," Miguel replied, handing him his phone. "See for yourself." With a mixture of amazement and horror, Carlos watched the video. Indeed, someone had captured the moment he was helping Dona Rosa breathe, and then part of his discussion with Gustavo. The comments were full of praise for him and criticism of the restaurant for its apparent lack of humanity. "This is crazy," Carlos muttered, returning the phone to Miguel. "I just wanted to help someone, not cause all this commotion." "Welcome to the era of social media, friend," said Miguel, patting him on the shoulder. "By the way, you have like 1,000 messages and friend requests. I think even a couple of local newspapers want to interview you." Carlos ran a hand over his face, feeling that the day was already getting out of hand. "I don't know if I'm ready for all this, Miguel. I just want to find a new job and move on with my life." "I understand. But maybe you should consider taking advantage of this attention, Miguel suggested. You could use this platform to talk about important issues like inequality or the lack of empathy in society. Carlos was about to respond when his phone started ringing. It was an unknown number. With some hesitation, he answered. "Hello, Carlos Rodriguez," a female voice asked on the other end of the line. "Yes, that's me. Good morning, Carlos. This is Dr. Martinez from Central Hospital. I'm calling regarding the patient who was admitted last night, Rosa Garcia. You're listed as the person who paid for her care." Carlos's heart skipped a beat. "That's right. Is something wrong with Dona Rosa?" "Mrs. Garcia is stable," the doctor assured him. "In fact, she's been asking for you. She says she has something important to tell you." Carlos remained silent for a moment, surprised by the request. "Of course," he finally responded. "I'll come as soon as I can." After hanging up, Carlos quickly explained the situation to Miguel. "Go," his friend said. "I'll take care of filtering your messages and keeping the journalists at bay for now." Grateful, Carlos quickly got dressed and left the apartment. While waiting for the bus in the drizzle, he couldn't help but wonder what Dona Rosa would want to tell him, and how this new turn of events would affect his already complicated situation. The trip to the hospital was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions for Carlos. On one hand, he was relieved to know that Dona Rosa was okay. On the other, the sudden media attention had him nervous. He had never sought to be the center of attention, and the idea of becoming a sort of local celebrity deeply uncomfortable him. When he arrived at Central Hospital, he had to go through reception to get Dona Rosa's room number. The receptionist looked at him with a mixture of recognition and admiration. "You're the waiter from the video, aren't you?" she asked while looking up the information on her computer. Carlos nodded uncomfortably. "Yes, I suppose so. What you did was very brave," she said with a warm smile. "The world needs more people like you." "Thank you," Carlos mumbled, feeling himself blush. "I just did what I thought was right." Upon reaching room 307, Carlos gently knocked on the door before entering. The image that greeted him surprised him. Dona Rosa was sitting up in bed, looking much better than the night before. Her gray hair was neatly combed, and she was wearing a clean hospital gown. Beside her, in a chair, sat an elegantly dressed older man in a suit that seemed to cost more than Carlos's monthly salary. "Carlos, my boy," exclaimed Dona Rosa upon seeing him, her face lighting up. Suddenly feeling shy, Carlos said, "Good morning, Dona Rosa. I'm glad to see you're feeling better." The man next to the bed stood up, extending his hand towards Carlos. "So you're the young hero I've heard so much about," he said with a deep, kind voice. "Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Eduardo Garcia, Rosa's husband." Carlos shook the man's hand, noticing his firm grip and the expensive watch adorning his wrist. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Garcia. I'm Carlos Rodriguez." "I know, young man," Eduardo replied with a smile. "My wife hasn't stopped talking about you since she regained consciousness. And I must say, I've also heard quite a bit about your actions in the news." Carlos shifted uncomfortably. "It really was nothing, sir. Anyone would have done the same." "Oh, but you're wrong, dear," Rosa intervened. "Not everyone would have risked their job to help an unknown old woman. What you did was extraordinary, and that's why we wanted to see you." Carlos took a seat in the other available chair, intrigued by the turn the conversation was taking. "You wanted to see me? Why?" Eduardo and Rosa exchanged a knowing look before the man spoke again. "You see, Carlos," Eduardo began, his tone becoming more serious, "there's something you should know about us. My wife and I, well, we're not exactly what we seem." Carlos frowned, confused. "I don't understand, sir." Rosa took over, her voice soft but firm. "What Eduardo means is that we're not beggars, Carlos. In fact, we're quite well off." The young man felt as if the floor was moving beneath his feet. But then why? Why was my wife dressed like a homeless person and entered that luxury restaurant?" Eduardo completed. "It's a long story, but we owe it to you." Over the next half hour, Eduardo and Rosa told Carlos a story that seemed straight out of a novel. It turned out that Eduardo was a successful businessman who had made his fortune in the real estate sector. He and Rosa had been married for over 40 years, but lately, they felt they had lost touch with the reality of ordinary people. "We realized we were living in a bubble," Rosa explained, "surrounded by luxury and people who only sought to take advantage of our fortune. We wanted to remember where we came from, to see how society treated the less fortunate. So we decided to conduct a social experiment," Eduardo continued. Rosa would dress as a homeless person and try to enter exclusive places. We wanted to see how people would react, if anyone would show compassion. Carlos listened in astonishment, trying to process all this information. But Dona Rosa, you really had an asthma attack. That couldn't have been faked. Rosa smiled sadly. You're right, dear. That part wasn't planned. I have chronic asthma, and the stress of the situation triggered a real attack. That's when you became our guardian angel. Eduardo put a hand on Carlos's shoulder. What you did, young man, goes beyond any expectation we could have had. You not only helped my wife in a moment of true need, but you sacrificed your job and your savings for someone you believed was a complete stranger. Carlos remained silent for a moment, trying to assimilate everything he had just heard. Part of him felt deceived, but another part understood the motivation behind the couple's actions. I understand why you did it, he finally said. But why are you telling me all this now? Eduardo and Rosa exchanged glances again before the man responded. Because we want to compensate you, Carlos, Eduardo said. Not just for helping my wife, but for being an example of what humanity should be. We want to offer you a job. Carlos blinked in surprise. A job? But you don't even know what skills I have. We know the most important thing, Rosa interrupted. We know you're compassionate, brave, and that you have integrity. Those are qualities that can't be taught, young man. Eduardo nodded, continuing the explanation. You see, Carlos, besides my real estate businesses, I have a foundation that works to help homeless people. After what you've demonstrated, I'd like to offer you a position as a project coordinator in the foundation. I think your perspective and your heart would be invaluable to our work. Carlos was speechless for a moment. The offer was incredible, almost too good to be true. But a part of him couldn't help feeling some discomfort. It's a very generous offer, he finally said, but I don't know if I can accept it. I feel like I'd be taking advantage of the situation. I didn't do what I did expecting a reward. Rosa extended her hand and took Carlos's. We know that, dear, and that's precisely why we want you to work with us. We're not offering you charity, but an opportunity to continue doing what is clearly your vocation, helping others. Eduardo added, besides, Carlos, think of all the good you could do from this position. You would have the resources and support to help many more people like you thought Rosa was last night. Carlos remained thoughtful, considering the offer. It was true that he had always wanted to do more for his community, but he had never had the means to do it on a large scale. This could be the opportunity he had been waiting for. Can I think about it? He finally asked. It's an important decision, and I don't want to make it lightly. Of course, Eduardo replied, taking a card out of his pocket and handing it to Carlos. Take all the time you need. Here's my contact information. When you're ready, call me, and we can discuss the details. Carlos took the card, feeling the weight of the decision he had ahead of him. Just at that moment, his phone vibrated in his pocket. As he took it out, he saw that he had dozens of social media notifications and several messages from unknown numbers. It seems you've become quite a celebrity, Rosa commented with a smile. Carlos's expression sobered. So it seems, he replied, putting the phone away with a sigh. Although I'm not sure how to handle all this attention. Maybe you could use that attention for something good, Eduardo suggested. Your story has inspired many people. You could take advantage of this to raise awareness about the problems faced by homeless people and how we can all make a difference. Carlos nodded slowly, considering the idea. I guess you're right. It's just that all of this is very overwhelming. 24 hours ago, I was just a waiter trying to make ends meet, and now you're a symbol of hope for many people, Rosa completed. I know it's a big responsibility, but I think you're up to the challenge, Carlos. At that moment, a nurse entered the room. I'm sorry, but visiting time is over. Mrs. Garcia needs to rest. 15 minutes after Carlos left Dona Rosa's room, the hospital corridor suddenly filled with commotion. Nurses and security personnel were running back and forth, and raised voices could be heard arguing heatedly. Carlos, who had stayed in the hospital cafeteria reflecting on Eduardo Garcia's offer, poked his head into the corridor to see what was happening. To his surprise, he saw an elegantly dressed man arguing with the security staff. It took him a moment to recognize him. It was Gustavo Mendez, his ex-boss from Lucille D'Or restaurant. I demand to see Eduardo Garcia immediately. Gustavo was shouting, his face reddened with anger and frustration. I know he's here. Carlos approached cautiously, unsure if he should intervene. It was then that Gustavo saw him. You, exclaimed Gustavo, pointing at Carlos. You're part of this, aren't you? Is it some kind of conspiracy to ruin my restaurant? Before Carlos could respond, Eduardo Garcia appeared in the hallway, his imposing presence instantly silencing the commotion. Mr. Mendez, Eduardo said in a calm but firm voice, I understand you're upset, but this is neither the place nor the time to make a scene. If you have something to discuss with me, we can do it civilly in private. Gustavo seemed to deflate a bit in Eduardo's presence, but still maintained a defiant posture. Fine, he growled. Let's talk in private. But I want answers. Eduardo nodded and guided Gustavo towards an empty waiting room. Before entering, he turned to Carlos. Carlos, would you mind joining us? I think your presence could be useful in this conversation. Surprised, Carlos nodded and followed them into the room. Once inside, Eduardo closed the door and turned to Gustavo. Now, Mr. Mendez, what exactly do you want to know? Gustavo took a deep breath, trying to control his temper. I want to know what's going on. First, a woman who looks homeless enters my restaurant and causes a commotion. Then I find out she's the wife of one of the richest men in the city. And now my restaurant is being attacked on social media and in the press for alleged discrimination. What kind of game are you playing? Eduardo listened patiently, his expression impassive. When Gustavo finished, the businessman sat in one of the chairs and gestured for the others to do the same. Mr. Mendez, Eduardo began, I understand your frustration, but I assure you that there is no game or conspiracy underway. What happened last night was the result of a social experiment that my wife and I decided to conduct, and the unexpected consequences that arose from it. Over the next few minutes, Eduardo explained the experiment to Gustavo, just as he had done with Carlos earlier. He spoke about their desire to understand how society treats the less fortunate, and how the incident at the restaurant hadn't been planned, but an unexpected turn of events. Gustavo listened in silence, his expression changing from anger to disbelief, and finally to a mixture of shame and understanding. So, Gustavo finally said, his voice calmer, it wasn't a deliberate attempt to discredit my restaurant? Not at all, Eduardo replied. In fact, your restaurant was chosen at random. It could have been any high-end establishment in the city. Gustavo sank into his chair, running a hand over his face. My God, what have I done? He murmured. Carlos, who had been observing the exchange in silence, finally spoke. Mr. Mendez, no one expected things to unfold this way. We all made mistakes last night. Gustavo looked at Carlos, a mixture of emotions crossing his face. Carlos, I owe you an apology. I reacted poorly last night. I was so worried about the restaurant's image that I forgot what really matters, compassion and good service that you always provided. Eduardo observed the exchange with interest. Mr. Mendez, it seems you have an exceptional employee in Carlos. Or should I say, had. Gustavo nodded sadly. Yes, and it was my mistake to let him go. Carlos, if you'd like to come back to Lucille D'Or, your position is available. In fact, I'd like to offer you a promotion to supervisor. We need more people like you to set the right example. Carlos was surprised by the offer. But before he could respond, Eduardo intervened. Actually, Mr. Mendez, I've also offered Carlos a job at my foundation. But perhaps there's a way for all of us to win in this situation. Both Gustavo and Carlos looked at Eduardo curiously. What do you mean? Gustavo asked. Eduardo smiled. I was thinking of a collaboration. Lucille D'Or could partner with my foundation to create a training and employment program for homeless people or those in vulnerable situations. They could learn service and cooking skills in a fine dining environment, and those who demonstrate aptitude could even be hired permanently. Gustavo seemed to consider the idea, a spark of interest lighting up in his eyes. It's an interesting proposal. It would certainly help improve the restaurant's image after this incident. And it would make a real difference in many people's lives, Carlos added, excited by the possibility. Eduardo nodded. Exactly. And Carlos, you could be the perfect liaison between the restaurant and the foundation. You could work part-time in each place, overseeing the training program and ensuring it's implemented correctly. Carlos felt his heart race at the prospect. It was an opportunity to combine his restaurant experience with his desire to help others. What do you say, gentlemen? Eduardo asked, looking at Gustavo and Carlos. Are you willing to turn this difficult situation into an opportunity to do good? Gustavo straightened in his chair, a new determination shining in his eyes. Mr. Garcia, I accept your proposal. It's time for Lucille D'Or to become an example of excellence not only in the kitchen but also in social responsibility. Both men looked at Carlos, waiting for his response. The young man felt the weight of the decision on his shoulders, but also a growing excitement at the possibilities opening up before him. "I accept too," Carlos finally said, a smile forming on his face. "I think together we can do something really special." Eduardo smiled, satisfied. "Excellent, then, gentlemen. It seems we have work to do." The three men stood up, shaking hands to seal their new agreement. Just as they were about to leave the room, the door opened and Rosa entered, accompanied by a nurse. "Did I miss something?" Rosa asked with a mischievous smile. Eduardo approached his wife, taking her hand. "My love, I think our little experiment has had much bigger results than we ever imagined." As Eduardo updated Rosa on what had been agreed upon, Carlos couldn't help but reflect on how a simple act of kindness had triggered a series of events that now had the potential to change many lives. He realized that sometimes the smallest actions can have the largest and most significant consequences. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of Carlos, Rosa, and the incident at Lucille d'Or became national news. But instead of being a scandal about discrimination, it transformed into an inspiring story about redemption, second chances, and the power of compassion. The training program at Lucille d'Or was launched with great success. Carlos, dividing his time between the restaurant and Eduardo's foundation, found himself at the center of an initiative that was changing lives. He saw how people who had once been ignored or looked down upon flourished under the tutelage of professional chefs, gaining not only valuable skills but also confidence and dignity. Gustavo, for his part, experienced a personal transformation. The man who had once cared only about image and status was now a passionate advocate for corporate social responsibility. Lucille d'Or became a role model in the industry, demonstrating that culinary excellence and social awareness were not mutually exclusive. Eduardo and Rosa continued their philanthropic work, but now with a renewed focus and a deeper understanding of the challenges faced by people in vulnerable situations. Their experience had reinforced their commitment to making a real difference in their community. And as for Carlos, he discovered that he had found his true calling. He was no longer just a waiter, but a mentor, a facilitator, and a bridge between two worlds that rarely intersected. Every day, seeing the smiles on the faces of the people he helped, he remembered that sometimes all it takes to change the world is an act of kindness and the will to stand up for what is right. The story of that night at Lucille d'Or became a local legend, a reminder that even in the most unexpected places and in the most unlikely circumstances, compassion and humanity can flourish, transforming not only individual lives but entire communities. And so, what began as a simple gesture from a waiter towards an apparently indigent old woman became the catalyst for a movement of social change, proving that indeed, a small act of kindness can trigger a wave of transformation that reaches far beyond what we could ever imagine. The end.